This is the revision podcast for economy after 1983. Thatcher's aims were still to cut taxes, cut public spending, cut local government, roll back the frontiers of state, to deregulate the economy, to curb civil service and make it less obstructive, to curb union power, and she felt after 1983 that she had the mandate to do this. And this, some people have argued, was Thatcherism. All of the above were. She appointed Nigel Lawson as their Chancellor instead of Geoffrey Howe, and he remained there from 1983 to 1989. So monetarism. Despite the U-turn speech, monetarism was gradually dropped and the Conservatives turned to supply-side economics. This created a demand by incentives rather than artificially stimulating, like Keynesianism suggests. She still wanted to reduce tax and did so, but also that would create an incentive to work harder because less was taken in tax. It encourages competition, lower prices and limit trade union powers. She wanted to cut welfare and save money and decrease the dependency culture. This is all similar to monetarism in lots of ways. It's still free enterprise. But the use of sterling M3 to keep a tight check on the amount of money in the system was dropped because it was a lot more difficult than they thought to actually get the figures right. Let's have a look at the deregulation part of the economic policies. It was to remove financial and legal restrictions which Thatcher believed prevented efficiency. Credit and exchange controls abolished. Bus companies were deregulated, schools could opt out of state funding and do their own financing. Hospitals were required to do their own financing. Council houses were sold off to people who wanted to buy them, roughly about 100,000 for each year of the 1980s. They got them at a discount of between 33 to 50%. And local authorities were barred from putting these profits back into housing. This is to encourage private landlords, but actually meant a lack of social housing. Another example of deregulation was the Big Bang in 1986, when the SEAQ screens came online on the stock markets, and it blew away old traditions and internationalised the stock market, increasing traffic by 15 times out of the early 80s, but it also caused the crash of 1987. There was a desire to create a property-owning democracy, to increase those with a stake in the country, and this was given by the 1980 Housing Act with the right to buy, but increased after 1983. She allowed building societies to become banks, for example the Abbey National, and she encouraged people to borrow and buy foreign consumer goods, which led to a balance of payment deficit from 16 billion to 47 billion pounds in the 1980s. Privatisation. Denationalisation would be another word for it, selling off state-owned industries, but it's also contracting out. Public services and private companies bid for contracts. The deregulation of the bus companies, therefore they could no longer have monopolies. It was additional to the deregulation of the city, and it's driven by an anti-socialist ideology. Socialists believing in Clause 4 nationalisation. It also meant that if people own their own stuff like shares or their own houses, they'd be less likely to want to give that up and give it back to the country as a whole. It's also to get people to aspire to want to do better for themselves. As a result though, it gave the Treasury massive funds, and it gave the people a chance for shares. Private owning of shares went up from 3 million to 9 million in the years of Thatcher's premiership. Shares were advertised in a big way, and this would garner more support for capitalism. The revenue from these privatisations were not ring-fenced, but it was absorbed into government spending and was given back to the electorate as a tax cut. It started off straight away with BP and British Aerospace in 1980, but the rest came after 1984. British Airways, British Steel, British Coal, Cable and Wireless, BT, Regional Electricity and Water, all were sold off after this time, and it raised £7,000 million by 1989. BT, for example, were facing a crisis anyway, and they needed millions to pay for a new communication system. The shares were sold off in 1984 and doubled their shareholders in one day. By 1992, 46 businesses had left the private sector. The Ofs were set up to oversee newly privatised industries, Ofcom, for example. North Sea Oil was privatised, even though Scottish people had said that it should just be Scottish. Now, radical Thatcherites wanted to actually privatise the NHS and railways, but public services were not privatised at all, and the railways were left till Major's time. Rowe says this signals the end of consensus, this privatisation, and the left despaired as it took away their power, especially as nationalising them again would cost so much. Let's have a look at taxes. Thatcher boasted of low taxation, and whilst true as direct taxes, indirect taxes meant that tax overall was only slightly lower in 1990 than 1979, VAT being an example of indirect tax. There were tax cuts in every annual budget bar one between 1979 and 1990, and in 1987 budget, the basic rate of income tax was cut from 29% to 27% and down to 25% by 1988. Corporation tax was reduced. All this caused a Lawson boom and inflation went back up to 10.9%, which was actually higher than in 1980, and it caused the UK to join the ERM. Britain had a poor balance of payments in this time, and personal pensions were launched in this time. Eventually, it was a poll tax that was part of the reason that Thatcher resigned, as it was very unpopular. Let's have a look at industry. Despite a lot of industries going under in Thatcher's time, in 1979 to 1989, productivity went up in industry by 4.2%. It's the largest growth rate in British history and way above other countries at the time. Unemployment rates in this country were low compared to Europe. And overall, welfare spending went up. Government spending was 43.2% of GDP in 1980 and 42.5% in 1995. The public spending borrowing requirement, PSBR, went down, which reduced debt. Thatcher's government became more centralised and intervening in some ways, especially over local government, also the national curriculum and quangos. And especially in the south, the haves, their real wages outstripped inflation. But you could argue she created a poverty trap for the unemployed, where they're actually better off staying on the dole rather than going out and trying to find a job which would give them less money. Finally, let's look at local government. Before Thatcher, the Conservatives had been defenders of local democracy, but between 1979 and 1994, 150 Acts of Parliament removed powers from the local government. Money got taken away as well and given to the unelected companies and bodies, and not the local elected councils. So, historical interpretation. Labour say that North Sea oil was squandered to fund a short-term gain, whereas Thatcher supporters would say that the oil industry was in long-term decline anyway. Thatcher supporters would also say the shift in employment was necessary from an industrialised to a service economy. It's just the way that Britain had evolved over the last 50 years or so. Plus, industry was now more streamlined and more efficient. Alan Sked calls Thatcher's policies an economic miracle, and Lynch says that it was arguably the North Sea oil taxes that brought billions into the treasury, was that rather than economic growth which funded benefits, etc., and saved the Thatcher government from its own recession later on in the 80s. Rose says many of the shares of privatisation were bought up by big companies eventually, so Thatcher's ideal of people owning more personal shares never really came about, not for long anyway. The city became a place where bigger risks were taken and bigger fortunes were made, says Rose. He says the successes of the Thatcher government were council houses were popular and created revenue, privatisation was popular, the curb of the trade unions was well done, local government finances were centralised, for example the abolition of the GLC, the Big Bang and consumer boom and the personal prestige that this brought for Thatcher. But the failures of the Thatcher government in economy was that it failed to cut government expenditure. There was no industrial recovery. The trade unions' curb of power was only just caused social problems. Profits from North Sea oil and other ventures are not used to invest in economic modernisation. Derek Murphy says that Thatcher seemed to be delivering an economic miracle in the prosperous parts of the country where the Conservative vote was already concentrated. Murphy says the privatised industries became private sector monopolies with very little competition. Tebbit thought the Thatcher revolution was not quite finished and should have gone further. Morse says London kept its prestige and bankers because USSR kept dollars there and because they loaned dollars because Americans were not. London financed many projects and companies came to London to get in on the act, Japanese and USA banks for example. Morse says Thatcher was uncertain about getting rid of exchange controls and that he believes that the Big Bang was the single most important act of the Thatcher administration, along with union curb of power and privatisation. He says without the Big Bang Britain's books would be in a worse condition, and he believes that Thatcher didn't like the word privatisation or use it very much. He says that government always erred on getting maximum spread of ownership of shares rather than the maximum price. So it was an ideological thing where they wanted more people to own shares and actually make a big profit from it. He says that, this is still more, the public have become one-time shareholders, not long-term ones like she hoped. And he says that privatisation didn't always equal efficiency, unless they were thrust into competition immediately, like Rolls-Royce for example. Lawson says my real mistake was to create a climate of optimism that encouraged borrowers to borrow more than they should and lenders to lend more than they should. Gordon Brown called the Big Bang and recession proof of Tory boom and bust. Peter Riddell calls privatisation Thatcher's biggest innovation. Harold Macmillan, said she was selling off the family silver. Patrick Walsh-Atkins says privatisation was very popular with voters and helped her win, especially the 1987 election. He also says it is the key part of the Thatcherite revolution and has become permanent. The government lost a tool though with social policy in creating jobs. Walsh-Atkins goes on to say that with Thatcher, economics were the method. The object was to change the heart and the soul of Britain. And David Charles says Thatcherism was just Reaganism adapted to Britain.